Okay, I guess we are live. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another Saturday series. Welcome, Jeannine. It's so nice to have you here. So, I know a few people will log on in some time. So, anybody who's here, thank you so much for being here. It is amazing. We are back to our Saturday expert series. If you are watching this live, say a quick hi. If you are watching this as a replay, please, post your name or comment in the comment section, so we will definitely know that you're here. If you have any questions for me or Janine, you can definitely contact either of us for more information. This is super exciting because tomorrow is the post traumatic stress disorder awareness day, which is exceptionally important because we have no idea how much trauma people go through. A lot of the Western culture, or even in some aspects of the Indian culture, we are supposed to deal with trauma. We are supposed to deal with emotional issues or mental health issues by ourselves, which is not true. You need to get support, you need to talk about it, and you need to find ways where you can start healing yourself, right? And especially to bring awareness to PTSD, which I know a lot of my clients have gone through as well. I'm here with Jeannine L. Rashidi. She is an Ayurveda practitioner. She has 18 years of experience working with the mind, the psyche, as well as PTSD. So it is so amazing to have you here, Jeannine.
Thank you.
Welcome to Saturday Expert Series. How are you doing today?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, and I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, it's so nice. Yeah. And I'm going to say a quick hi to Linda from Canada. I hope I'm getting your name right because the spelling is slightly different. And yeah, if you're watching this live, just say a quick hi. So I would love to ask you, Janine, that how did you start your journey towards working with mental health, right? So do you have any backstories to share, and how did you get interested in this topic? And I know there is also this amazing book that you've written, which is about helping people move beyond the trauma with abundance, right? So abundance beyond trauma is a book that you've written. So how did you get interested in this topic, and how did your journey with mental health start?
So, my journey actually began by healing myself. So, the first 25 years of my life, I experienced severe emotional, mental, physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. So I ran away from home when I was 15 years old, even though I was a straight A student, very likely to go on to college and even medical school. But there were no classes to teach me with what was going on in my home life, and my parents were very imbalanced. So I felt it was better to run away from home. And so at 15, I dropped out of school. I hitchhiked 500 miles and I learned to live on the street, and I met, some very interesting people, mainly Vietnam vets.
Mhm.
So obviously there was relatability because I already had trauma. I did not know what PTSD was at the time, but I certainly could relate when they were having flashbacks. And I noticed that their drug use, their alcohol use was to avoid having that experience, which gave me an interesting perspective as to why my parents intoxicated themselves as well.
Mhm.
So during that time, I met a man who was 17 years my senior. And he said he didn't want to be, in drugs and didn't want to follow in his parents' footsteps. And so I naturally believed him. And of course, when he said, I love you, because I was lacking so much of that love that I needed, from mother and from father, I believed him. And
Mhm.
it would take another 10 years to get out of yet another abusive situation with him where the same things were happening. Only by now, I had my first daughter when I was 16, my second daughter when I was 20, and now
Mhm.
they were showing the same signs as what I had experienced. And
Mhm.
so this really broke my heart because I left home thinking I'm going to get out of this. And I ended up falling right back into the same cycle. So, why does this happen? See, when
Mhm.
we don't heal from the trauma that we've had, statistically, we are more likely to fall into the same pattern of abuse and dysfunction, or even worse, we could even end up being the abuser. It just depends how things go.
Mhm.
And so that's what happened. I hadn't healed my mother issues, father issues. So I had now this first marriage that was very dysfunctional. So when I finally was able to leave that situation with my daughters, one, I had to rebuild my entire life. And two, the first question I had was, how does this happen and how can I prevent it from carrying on further? I
Mhm.
didn't want my daughters to drop out of school, didn't want them to be, have teen pregnancy, and I certainly didn't want them to become drug addicts. And so that was my drive, that was my motivation. So while my daughters and I were in counseling, I needed to start a profession where I could create my own hours.
Mhm.
And so it was a very logical decision to get into the health and wellness field. Now, as far as the specialty where clients are coming in that have trauma, PTSD, adverse life experiences, this was happening organically. I was not advertising for this. And I questioned, am I the right practitioner to be helping people because I'm still trying to figure it out? But the universe is very serendipitous in its ability to just bring people together. And it turns out that this is the perfect profession. So as I was healing, I realized I could only assist my clients up to the point at which I had healed myself.
Mhm.
So my clients were great teachers for me in that it pushed my edges and my boundaries where I had to keep working on myself while also healing with my daughters and dealing with, some of the flashbacks and trauma responses that were happening for the three of us.
Mhm.
And so that's how I got into the field. Ayurveda came in about 2013. And that's when I, could bring in more of the aspects of diet and lifestyle, how to balance the mind and body system with different foods, different, breathing practices and things like that. So when I decided to write my book, the biggest passion and thought that came was, what would I have wanted that I didn't have to get me through some of these really intense moments? Because I was the type that was triggered all the time.
Mhm.
Many people didn't know that. I could very well present myself, but I was really having a hard time internally.
Mhm.
And so the contribution I wanted to make to anyone who had adverse life experiences, trauma, or PTSD was some sort of guide that will help you get through a trigger
Mhm.
and start healing it. It's one thing to be able to get yourself out of it, but you don't want a trigger to happen. You don't want to go through it again. But you have to have courage to turn around and look at what is it that's triggering you.
Mhm.
So I see triggers actually as a blessing, and I'll explain why. So when we go through a traumatic event, if it's too much for our psyche to handle, there's a disconnect that happens in the heart mind. I call it the heart and mind disconnect. So a part of us disconnects because it's too much to handle. And then we keep going through life, but that part's still disconnected.
Mhm.
So then a trigger happens. Well, that trigger is actually that disconnected aspect that's gotten activated and is now reliving a trauma time loop. And so
Mhm.
all of the responses that are happening are from that aspect.
Mhm.
So many of my responses when I would get triggered were from a very immature and unresolved place. And upon reflection, even I was like, wow, that was really, it didn't quite make sense. Well, it's because it was disconnected from me.
Mhm.
And so, why it's important to really honor our triggers is because it's a part of ourselves trying to get our attention. We
Mhm.
need to be able to turn around and look at that aspect, see what's going on, and offer it healing. And we have the ability to do that. Ayurveda talks a lot about the inner healer. We are all our own healer. It's just some of us need a facilitator or a practitioner to help awaken that healer, unmask the healer. Because often we forget, especially if we've had trauma or adverse life experiences. So in the back of my book, there is an I'm Triggered pocket guide. And that's probably one of the most valuable pieces of information that I wanted to offer everyone, which is why it's in the free downloadable workbook on my website. And what I'd like to do is, at some point during this talk, is go through it so that anyone who's watching or plans to watch will be able to get themselves out of a trigger and start working on healing it.
Mhm. No, that's really, amazing. So thank you so much for sharing your story. And it is a story from a lot of trauma to empowerment, right? And this is extremely important, that one of the things you mentioned was, what we don't heal is going to find, maybe in the next generation. And I see lots of clients with generational trauma, the moms went through the same thing. Now the daughters are going through the same thing. And it is because essentially those unhealed, unresolved parts, and with Ayurveda too, we talk about all the sanskaras that become a part of us, like because you're not mindful of it or aware of it at the time, doesn't mean that it's not there. So these triggers are always going to be lying around somewhere in your psyche, in your mind, until the time you really take charge of your health, really take charge of your emotional, mental health, you're not going to be aware enough to heal of this. So it's like, it's just amazing to have you here and talk about this topic. Going to say a quick hi to Susan. Again, for everybody watching, if you have any questions for me or Janine, you're most welcome to put it in the comment section. If you're watching this live, say a quick hi so I know you're here. um, so my question is, you talk about, going through those trauma time loops or flashbacks, right? So how does one get an awareness that they're kind of stuck in the flashbacks? Because sometimes when they're happening, people don't even understand that, okay, this is my trigger. They always think about it as a response to something just happened, like in a conversation I'm having with probably my husband, something triggers me, but I think it's just this and not the past, right? So how important it is to identify those triggers. And another question is, how can you identify that it's a trigger, or go back to it? Yeah.
That's a great question. So there's actually a worksheet in the workbook as well as the book itself on how to identify your triggers. So the way that I have experienced it personally and then working with others is anytime you are in an interaction with someone or something and you have a feeling that is evoked and you no longer are hearing the person that you're interacting with, or if you notice there's a flood of emotion coming, something has been triggered. Oftentimes, if we start pointing the finger, and this is going to sound cliche, you're always supposed to look at the three fingers pointing back at you. Well, there's actually truth to that because we're trying to blame something or someone for our experience instead of taking the self-responsible approach of, well, what's really going on? Why are you having such a passionate or emotional response? And it's
Mm,
important to understand, where is that coming from? So you first have to identify, well, what are you feeling as a result of this interaction? And I list, multiple feelings in the book because even that sometimes we can't put words to,
mhm,
especially if we're triggered. And so trying to identify what exactly are you feeling is the first thing.
mhm,
And then the second one is try to narrow down at what point did you start having that experience so you can really hone in on what was the triggering factor. Is it actually the person themselves that you're interacting with? Was it a smell? Was it a way they had a facial expression? Was it their
mhm,
body language? And it's giving you an opportunity to kind of pull away and look at it from a bigger lens to understand what was it that actually got to you and really pulled you into that triggered state.
mhm,
So once you have identified your feeling, then you've identified, okay, at what point did you get triggered? Then you can start looking at what needs to be healed there.
mhm,
So, for example, let's say this is one of the examples I use in the book. So here's a little boy who's just drawn this most amazing picture for his mother. And let's say he's
mhm,
about 2 or 3. And he's put all of his heart and soul into drawing this beautiful image. And he goes to show his mother, who has multiple children, and she's now cooking dinner. So here he is. He's heart open and vulnerable. He's trying to share. And she rejects him, not intentionally, but she was busy cooking dinner, right?
Mhm.
Now, that may not sound like a traumatizing experience. And I don't like to get caught up in labels because for that particular situation, that impression stayed with that little boy where he was wanting mother to acknowledge all of the love that he put into that drawing for her. And she did not even acknowledge him. So now here he is as an adult, and he's finding that in his marriage and any of his female relationships, he's very needy. He's
Mhm.
needing a lot of acknowledgement. You know, now that's a bit more of a relatable experience versus if somebody has had, you know, some of the traumas like I've had. But it is that simple. It could be something like that, where if he could go back and look at that part of himself as a little boy who
Mhm.
didn't get that acknowledgement, then the healing can start happening.
Mhm.
And the process that I created called Adhere, part of the healing is you come in as this big universal archetype, whether you come in as your own guardian, your own mother, your own father. And in this case, I would guide this person to come in as the mother
Mhm.
so that he could give that mother archetypal love and acknowledgement to that part of himself.
Mhm.
And it's very empowering when you realize you can actually give yourself everything that you didn't get and needed from whether it's your parents or, you know, whoever it is. We have the ability to do this.
Mhm.
So that would just be one example.
Oh, and that is an amazing example because that was actually going to be my question, about trauma. That trauma is something that's experienced, and the experience varies on a individual basis, right? So I often see clients, who have PTSD or who've gone through significant trauma, but because they like the perceived trauma, they don't validate it as severe as somebody else who might have gone through abuse or something, so they try to shut it down and they're like, oh no, but it's not as bad as this, right? So
Right.
again, the one thing that, the point that you've made, and that is exactly what I was going to ask you, is no trauma is, big or less, or it's not, you can't compare apples and oranges. You don't have to compare your trauma to somebody else's trauma, right? You just have to understand that, okay, this is a part of your experience which has triggered you, or which has left a vacuum in you where you are emotionally vulnerable. And until you heal that trigger, it's going to keep showing up in different forms, via different people, via different places, sometimes work relationships, personal relationships, right?
Yeah.
So if you're watching this, that's the one thing to understand, that don't compare. And it could be something that sounds simple, as Janine has mentioned, that a boy with a drawing, but it's about how much love you put in, or what was your emotional need at the time which was not recognized, right? So that could definitely create, a situation of trauma, though it might not be the kind of trauma we see nowadays, which is, or we don't think about it as severe. So this is, thank you for making that point. So you mentioned about these disconnected aspects of us, right? And we really need to heal them, we really need to integrate them. Another interesting aspect you mentioned was, looking at through a point of either expressions or senses, like hearing what was the sound like, or what was happening. So one comment again I would love to make is with Ayurveda, and other holistic sciences. There's holistic nutrition, there's other sciences which are more holistic, but we look at senses as the connection between, your mind as well as your soul, especially, and the body. So that was very interesting that you made that point. But going back, I think I'm kind of going all over because this is such an
That's okay.
amazing topic. Yeah. So how would you, get back or reconnect those disconnected aspects? And how would you, once you've learned that, okay, this is my trigger, how do you get about healing them?
That's a great question. So, in the I'm Triggered Pocket Guide, which I think what I'll do is I'll just walk you through it
Okay.
so you get an idea. So, the first thing to remember is when you're in a triggered state, do not make any decisions. This is super important because any decision you make from a triggered place is from that unresolved aspect, which means any decision you make could have a huge impact on your life. So, step one, don't make any decisions. Try to give yourself a timeout. And usually, this is a universal sign. You don't have to explain to anyone what's happening. You just excuse yourself. Try to take the self-responsible approach if you're in that place in your healing. Not everybody can do this yet, and that's okay. You can only begin from where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
So don't make any decisions, give the timeout sign, and then we have to catch the breath, because wherever the breath goes, the mind follows.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've ever been in an extremely triggered place, to try to stop and take a deep breath is very challenging, because all of that adrenaline is pumping and is very hard to slow the breath down. So I say let's follow the flow of the breath so that we can start getting it under control.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to do 2 quick inhales and a long exhale. And we keep following that pattern to try to slow down the breath. So you're going to stop, don't make any decisions, give yourself a time out, and then try to start following your breath. Now, the second one is most likely you're in a fight, flight, or freeze response. So we need to give the mind something to do, because we need to bring you back to the present moment. A trigger is taking you out of presence, because it's that disconnected aspect trying to communicate. So what we want to do is we want to try to locate 3 objects that are within this, that represent this time and space. So I say find 3 things that represent consciousness, whether it's, or that are alive. So the plant that's growing on my ceiling, the water that I've poured this morning in my cup, and the wind that's blowing in the trees.
Mm-hmm.
So those are 3 things that I've identified. And what that does is it keeps the eyes moving. That way we're not freezing, but you're also giving the mind something to do so that you don't start fighting or fleeing.
Mm-hmm.
So you've done your locational, you keep following the breath. So then the third step, you need to identify your well-wishers, the people that you trust in your worst moment. These are the people that maybe you could reach out to when you're having that experience. Say, hey, I'm not doing well. I need some support. And most of the time, just thinking about them will help calm you down. So you're going to identify your well-wishers. And if you're like I was and you didn't trust anybody, then try to identify a safe place in your mind. So mine was always the beach. So I would imagine the waves of the ocean. And so as you're identifying either a safe place or your well-wishers, more than likely the breath has begun to slow down, and you can either now start taking a deep diaphragmatic breath, or you keep with the 2 quick inhales and long exhale.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the first 3 major steps that will help you get out of that experience. But now what we need to do is we need to come in and heal it. And that's where the adhere process I created. So it's pronounced as the word adhere, which means to be true to, but it's an acronym spelled EDHIR. So the first one is explore, and this is where we need to explore, what are you feeling?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where you try to identify the feeling and experience that you're having. Once you've done that, you can go to the second phase, which is to discover. You need to discover at what point did that trigger happen. And this may take a little bit of time. And sometimes what you need to do to identify the trigger is you need to come back into your body. And sometimes that's challenging. So there's a chapter in my book called Is Your Big Toe Triggered? And I have to give my husband credit for that one, because he asked me that one time when I was in a triggered state, and it caught me off guard. And then I started laughing. Well, that's the whole point. We're trying to get out of our head about this. And so you need to start asking different body parts. Are you triggered? And it helps give your mind something to do, and then really tune into different parts to see, okay, not all of me is triggered, but there is a part of me that is.
Mm-hmm.
And once you can discover that, then you can now look at the situation and go, okay, what part of that situation triggered, let's say, my heart? And so now once you've discovered the trigger, then you can go in and heal it. So you've explored your feelings, you've discovered what has triggered you. Well, now you need to get big. And this is probably my most favorite part, because if you've been in any type of abuse, it's something or someone that was much bigger than you,
Mhm.
and you felt was more overbearing came in and, did something to you, or an experience happened to you that was big. So this part of the healing is very empowering because now you get to get big. You get to be responsible for that part of you. So
Mhm.
you're regaining the power that you felt was lost, or that was lost because of the trauma. So when I say get big, you're going to get so big that you can have a 360-degree view within your mind of that part of you that got triggered. So now here you are, you're this universal guardian looking at a 360-degree view of the part of you that's not quite as resolved and disconnected. So now, as you're looking at that part of you, what do you need?
Mhm.
Now, for those of us who've had trauma, we do know what we need because we know what we didn't get.
Mhm.
So, as you're observing this part of you, you can look and see, does that part of you need nourishment? Do you need security? Do you need to build trust? And most of the time, there needs to be almost like a ceremony built of trust between you and this part of you, because this part of you does, in a way, feel abandoned. They've been disconnected this whole
Mhm.
time. So you're getting big, you're seeing, what is it that you need? Then you can start the next phase, which is to heal it. And
Mhm.
as you're giving yourself all of that healing, you keep offering whatever healing needs to happen. And it's a dialogue that you're having with that part of you.
Mhm.
And it could be that that part of you is able to communicate with words. Maybe they're not. Maybe you need to look at their body language. After all, you're coming in as, this guardian that's more like the higher self.
Mhm.
So there's a part of you that intuitively and innately knows what you need. So as you're giving yourself all of this healing, once it feels like it's complete, and you will know that through this whole time, you're still following your breath because you are having both of these experiences. You're coming in as the higher self, looking at a part of you that's not resolved. So it is important that you keep following the breath because, again, wherever the breath goes, the mind follows. We don't want to get caught in the story
Mhm.
of what's happening. We want to, keep it, as a big perspective. So almost like watching it on a movie screen. Don't jump into the movie, just watch the movie and see what needs to happen. And once it seems like that's been healed, then you're going to go to the integration phase. And this is where it's really beautiful. Most clients, if they haven't already broken down crying, and it's actually really important that those emotions have an opportunity to express themselves and move. This is where the larger part of you and the part that just has been healed is now going to come in and become one. And so there's a couple different ways that we can do that. Oftentimes, I will lead a client to approach that part of themselves and hold hands. So there's this physical contact of security, and then look into each other's eyes. So you're essentially looking at yourself deep within yourself. So as you're looking into each other's eyes, you're following the breath, you're making whatever promises need to happen so that there's trust built. So in
Mhm.
my own healing, I needed to make many promises of, I'm not going to abandon you. I promise I'm always going to be there for you. I'm going to hear you when you're communicating, etc. And so as the breathing is happening together, you've got that physical contact. You keep that going until the two of you merge and become one.
Mhm.
So now you've integrated, and now I always like to test things out. So before we come to the last phase, I want you to take yourself back to the moment you got triggered and notice, does it have the same charge, the same
Mhm.
activating triggered feeling? If it doesn't, great, we can move on to the final phase, which is to relate. But if there is still something there, I want you to go back and go through all these steps again because you must have missed something. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just keep doing it.
Mhm.
And so then once that's done, we move into the final phase, which is to relate. So there was a part of you that was disconnected, and now it's become part of you. That means that you are a more integrated whole. You have to get to know yourself now. You have no idea who you are, what you will feel or experience as a result of bringing this part of you into integration. And so I encourage people to go on a date with themselves. That's what we do when we try to get to know people, whether it's platonically or intimately. We date each other. Well, why aren't we doing that with ourselves? Because the most important relationship we have is with ourself.
Yeah.
The relationship I have with myself determines how I will relate with you and the relationships that are attracted into my life. So
Mhm.
if I don't fix that core relationship with myself, it's going to have an effect on everything else.
Mhm.
So, and then that also means that the people around you may relate with you differently.
Mhm.
It may take them time. I've had experiences where, other people get triggered because now I'm different.
Mhm.
That's how we grow. It's important to, have space to figure out, well, who am I now?
Mhm.
And then allow the people around you to also have space to figure out, well, who are you now? And how will we interact differently? And that's the whole process.
That's a beautiful process. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing it. And how often, like if somebody is in a constantly triggered state, that is also very common with somebody who is having PTSD and they're going through a similar situation right now, which is triggering all their past trauma, right? So, how often can somebody practice this process that you've shared with us?
Well, you can do it as often as you have the capacity and capability. The
Mhm.
one thing that I will make sure to mention, and this was an important piece of my healing actually that came from my Ayurvedic Vaidya and teacher, and that's Dr. Jaya Rajan Kodikanath. He said, Jeannine, you cannot keep approaching your healing like a machine because you're not a machine. Because I was, basically depleting myself, trying to, I'm going to heal it all,
Yeah.
and that was very, Rajasic and my pitta coming out. So it's all about balance. It's
Mhm.
not going to be healed in a day. But the fact that if you could just get your breath under control,
Mhm.
not make any decisions that are going to, make huge impacts in your life, and be able to keep your eyes moving, that already is a huge step. But
Mhm.
you also need to look at your diet and lifestyle. One of the most important pieces would be, are you sleeping at the right time? Mental digestion happens between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.
Mhm.
You need to get the right type of sleep, the right amount of sleep, making sure that you're eating wholesome meals to support the healing process. Because, yes, you've gone through this trauma. That was already a depleting and traumatic event on the body. It's left a huge impression. Well, healing is also going to take some energy. So we need to make sure that you're supporting, building up your ojas, not depleting yourself, so that you can keep healing. And when you're in that constantly activated state, it's really advisable to seek out a practitioner who could help you, because it is hard at first to be able to see from a bigger perspective. Because when you're triggered, your mind is in a very narrow perspective.
No, this is true. Sorry, I'm just going to attach my cord. My laptop has
Mhm.
really low energy. No, this is great information. I'm going to say a quick hi to Sweetie. Tanya says this is great information, 100%, and that's why Jeannine is here, right? And that is why we are talking about this important topic, because PTSD is again something that's ignored. We don't like to talk about our traumas, and you shouldn't be talking about your traumas with people you don't trust, but at the same time you should come to a point where you're able to share things to be able to seek that help, right? Jasmine is here as well. She said she joined late, but yeah, Janine, you put it so beautifully. Yes, 100%. Now, again, when it comes to PTSD and being in the Ayurvedic field, we see different behaviors when it comes to different doshas, right? Or dominant prakritis, for example. Uh, Usually, like the kaphas are the ones who will internalize a lot of things without being able to talk about it, or get into this blanket mode where just putting a blanket or ignoring or denial mode. The pittas
Right.
are who are like, I want to heal everything right now. I want to do everything right away and just get off it. And then the vatas keep doing the work, but like multiple works at the same time, getting exhausted, getting burnt out. So it's also very interesting to understand, the dosha manifestations from a personality point of view. One other thing is, what I've seen a lot with, people struggling with PTSD or traumas is the self blame, right?
Hmm.
That even though you're seeking help, even though you're really trying to move past the trauma, one of the biggest hurdles that keeps you from healing is the self critical nature, or the guilt, the self blame, blaming you or self for going through the experience or being a part of the experience. So any information that you have to be able to develop a healthy relationship with your own self, in order to move past the trauma completely. Because I've seen my clients, they'll come here, and I have a little of my own process that I guide my clients through. In Canada, I'm not a trained counselor, so I usually, will tell them to work with either a psychotherapist or a counselor. But at the same time, I have a small tidbit that I help them, with. So I'll share that eventually. But I would love to know your take on it. That how do you work with your clients who are self-critical, or who are indulging in a lot of self-blame and guilt for whatever the trauma has happened?
That's a great question, and that is a huge piece. The first thing I'd like to say is you did the best you could. So,
Mhm.
whatever the situation is or was, you've done the best you could with the tools that you have. Now, in my particular situation, it was very easy for me to have self blame on myself. One, for going right into a situation that, even though I wasn't aware that that's what was going to happen, going right into basically, another relationship that was similar to my parents and taking 10 years to get out of it. I
Mhm.
could easily blame myself for the abuse that then happened between, the my husband and our daughters, but that's not helpful. I'm not going to be able to heal if I keep self sabotaging myself by blaming myself. The reality is I did the best that I could. And when I look at what I brought to the table and how much trauma was already there,
Mhm.
I was just operating from where I was at. So every journey begins from where you're at. Don't be upset with where you're at. Just acknowledge it. Okay, so I was in a trauma state. I, was going to fall in love with the first person to tell me they loved me because I didn't get mother love and I didn't get father love. And
Mhm.
since all of my experiences of love were highly dysfunctional, I didn't know the appropriate love anyway. So how was I going to know that the first husband was going to, be the way that he was? So it's one, not helpful. So you have to catch that part of yourself, because we do have those self-sabotaging parts of ourself that come in, and they start, the mind chatter. So
Mhm.
again, you have to come in as that part of you that knows, all right, and I will have conversations with myself. I'm like, oh, there you go again, Jeannine, trying to convince me, that I'm not good enough, or it's my fault. And you and I both know that's actually not true. And then the mind chatter stops. So you have to be willing to have that conversation with yourself, because yes, there a lot of this is disconnected. And the more you connect, you will have less of those thoughts. But you
Mhm.
have to be willing to question those thoughts.
Mhm.
This is where I like to suggest the work of Byron Katie, because she asks really profound questions about your thought process, and that is it true?
Mhm.
Now, the first egoic response is going to be, well, of course it's true. But then the second question, kind of helps you get out of that. And that is, well, how do you know for certain what you're believing is true?
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
don't actually know. So
Yeah.
then who would you be without that thought?
Mhm.
And that's a profound question. Well, from my perspective, I was going to be this completely different person if I wasn't dominated by triggers. So I that motivated me to continue to question my thoughts. So I would say question those thoughts when you say, it's my fault this happened. Really, is that true?
Mhm.
And really examine yourself.
No, that's fantastic. I have a simple trick that I tell people, and I found it in. I was doing some online course, on self love and really understanding yourself, or stopping those self blaming, because I think there's an aspect to Pitta where you can be extremely self critical,
Oh,
right? And
yes.
you're constantly judging yourself. And I'm a Kapha Pitta, so I have certain aspects
Me
of it
too.
as well. So one thing that I tell my clients is, if you have a rubber band, or if you have a bracelet, right, which is an elastic bracelet, and every time you have that negative self-talk that, oh, you ate this, you're stupid, or oh, you said this, you're stupid, you just take that band and literally zap yourself with it, right?
That's a
So
great idea.
yeah, so it helps you associate pain with negative self talk, right? And if you
Mhm.
do this, like the first day, you'll be doing it 100 times, your wrist is really red, and your body eventually starts associating pain with negative self talk. And sometimes to get past through these behaviors that were built up for a long time, sometimes, if you're born through overachiever parents, you go through the dysfunctional family, you end up feeling not enough for not your problem. There was something else in the situation which was not enough, but you end up like soaking everything up, from your environment. So this is a great way to kind of give yourself a little bit, pain associated with negative self-talk. And if you're not ready for that sort of a pain again, one another thing is, keeping like an ornament or maybe a ring which kind of grounds you in the present moment. Whatever has happened in the past. You're not responsible. Everybody does the best of the situation from what they're given. But right now, if you ground that, okay, that's done, let's move on. Right now I'm here, and like this is my zen ring, so I look at it and I'm going to be calm. So those are two very simple things that I use in my practice. But definitely this was an amazing conversation, and I really love your process, and thank you so much for sharing it with um, all our viewers, because this is an important topic that people either are ashamed of the trauma or hide from the trauma or are in denial with the trauma. But once you start accepting things, that's when you can really heal those parts of you, or they will always going to pop up at some time. It's not just because we ignore it, it doesn't go away. So most definitely. So Tanya saying thank you, she likes the idea of a grounding ring. Jasmine is saying good tip. Yeah, it's good to have that elastic around.
So I like to remember the, fear is a big piece. So I like to use the acronym of fear, which is face everything and rise,
oh, nice.
instead of fear everything and run.
Yeah,
So turn around and look at it.
yeah.
I know the rubber band thing I've heard of before. Sometimes most of the time our body's actually very intelligent. So there's something that my body does unconsciously, and it's funny because those that are close to me, they'll point it out, and my toe starts flicking on the floor when I'm trying to process and ground myself. And that's when I know, oh, there's something happening. I'm not quite aware of it yet, and my body's telling me. And in one of the case studies I shared in my book, there was a woman who came in and she had physical pain, and she had tried everything. And I said, what if we try this adhere process? And if you still have pain when we're done, I'll give you a free session. She
Mhm.
said, okay. And so we did it. And through that process, she realized a dynamic of a belief that she had around her father. It was showing up in her right shoulder. And
Mhm.
after we did that healing, the
It-
pain was gone.
Wow.
So her body was giving her the signal
Yeah.
of pain, and it was around a belief.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that's why in Ayurveda we talk about Abhyanga as a part of the daily routine, right? Because a lot of my clients, especially who are not familiar with Ayurveda, they'll be like, oh, I'd rather go to a massage therapist, right? And get a massage. But an Abhyanga is not equivalent to a massage. It is much
Mm.
deeper because it's a
Yeah.
self-soothing mechanism as well. You're not just doing it to balance, any aggravation of the vata, which we're all exposed to nowadays, but it's more about connecting with your body, connecting with each and every part of your body, and really kind of trying to soothe, trying to move through different things in your body. So I think that's why it's really important. Thank you, Jeannine. This is all the time we have. I could keep
Okay.
talking to you forever. But I'm in the clinic today, so I'm busy working
Yeah,
too.
me too.
But this was amazing. And can you share some information on where people can find you? And I have made a link to your book right in this chat, or the description of the video itself. So the
Sure.
book is available on Amazon, and the ebook, if they buy, they're going to get the worksheet with it, something like that. But I'll have you share more information on that. Yeah.
Sure. So the name of my practice is Goodbye Tension. So you can go to goodbyetension.com. There's a whole page for the book where you can download the free workbook, and you can, either buy the Kindle version, which is right now on sale for $5.99 in honor of PTSD Day. And then you can also get the paperback. And what's great about the paperback is that you can actually fill in some of the worksheets that are in here as well, which is also what's in the workbook. And both copies come with the I'm Triggered pocket guide. So there's a lot of tools in there. And if anyone has questions or concerns, you can go to goodbyetension.com and you can contact me there. I'd love to, just chat and see how I can be of help to awaken the healer within you.
That's perfect. So I did quickly share the links again in the chat here. So if you're on Facebook or YouTube, there's a link to the Goodbye Tension website. There's also a link to the book. So make sure, if you are on your healing journey, get connected with Jeannine, let her help you. If you're local, you want to connect with me, you're most welcome to, get connected with me and get the book as well. So this will really help you. So thank you once again so much. And I'm hoping to get you back on the show, for the expert series soon.
That sounds great.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.